Zennials, the generation that held two worlds at once. There's a very specific kind of person who remembers rewinding a VHS tape before returning it to Blockbuster, and also remembers the exact week they downloaded their first MP3. Not someone who only knows streaming, not someone who never touched a cassette in their life, someone who lived through both, back to back, right in the middle of figuring out who they were. If you were born between 1976 and 1985, psychologists have spent decades genuinely unsure what to do with you. And that uncertainty, it turns out, is more revealing than it first appears. Naming the gap. In 2014, sociologist Sarah Stankorb gave this group a name for the first time: Zennials, a microgeneration born between 1977 and 1985, sitting in the narrow gap between Generation X and Millennials. Some researchers use a different label entirely: the Oregon Trail generation, a nod to the old educational computer game many of them played in school, a game built entirely around navigating uncertain terrain with limited supplies, constantly figuring out the next move as you went. It's a more accurate metaphor than it sounds. Most generational research works in broad, sweeping windows. Boomers, Gen X, Millennials, Gen Z, each spanning 15 to 20 years. Zennials occupy a window that's maybe 8 or 9 years wide. That's not really a generation in the traditional sense. It's a very specific, narrow moment in time. And what happened inside that narrow moment left a mark that broader generational categories simply can't explain. Not because this group is special in some superior sense, but because of exactly what happened during that window, and just as importantly, when it happened in their development. A childhood built before the internet existed. To understand what makes this group distinct, it helps to remember what everyday life actually looked like before the internet arrived. You passed notes in class on folded paper that could be intercepted and confiscated by a teacher at any moment. You made plans to meet someone at a specific corner at a specific time, then simply went there and waited, with no way to check whether they were running late, no way to send a quick message if plans changed. You either showed up or you didn't, and people remembered which kind of person you were. If you missed a television show, it was simply gone. You asked a friend to describe what happened, and spent the rest of the week reconstructing the episode in your imagination from someone else's second-hand account. And your mistakes, an argument at a party, something embarrassing said in front of the wrong person, an awkward phase in 9th grade, eventually faded. Nobody archived it. Nobody screenshotted it. It lived on in a handful of people's memories and slowly dissolved into something softer and less sharp, the way memories naturally do when nothing artificial is there to preserve them at full resolution. This matters more than it might seem. The brain is actually built for exactly this kind of process, to let details shift and soften over time, retaining what still matters emotionally, while gradually releasing what doesn't. Growing up in a world that allowed this natural process to happen meant that childhood itself could eventually become a story you tell, rather than a permanent, fully documented file you're forced to live inside forever, replayed in perfect detail whenever anyone wants to look it up. Then the world changed almost overnight. Right as this group was moving into their late teens and early 20s, the world changed, not gradually, but practically overnight. Email, mobile phones, Friendster, MySpace, broadband internet. Within the span of just a few years, the world they had grown up in essentially stopped existing, and a completely different one appeared to take its place. The timing here matters enormously. Research published in Nature Neuroscience has found that the part of the brain responsible for learning entirely new systems and adapting to unfamiliar structures continues, developing until roughly age 25. Zennials hit the entire digital revolution squarely inside that developmental window, old enough to remember clearly what life looked like before it, and young enough that their brains were still genuinely open and plastic enough to absorb what replaced it, rather than having to force it in through effort alone. Gen Xers, by contrast, largely had to learn the internet the way an adult learns a second language later in life, functional, sometimes even fluent with enough practice, but rarely fully effortless. Younger millennials and Gen Z, meanwhile, grew up entirely inside it. For them, the internet was never a tool they consciously picked up and learned to use. It's simply the water they've always swum in, with no memory of anything different. Xenials are the only group who genuinely hold both experiences at once. They remember what it felt like to leave the house and be completely, unreachably offline for hours at a stretch, with no way for anyone to find them. And they also move fluidly through a dozen different messaging platforms today without a trace of anxiety. Not because they're exceptional people, but because the developmental door was open at exactly the right moment. And then, for everyone born just a few years later or earlier, it quietly closed. The financial scarring nobody talks about. There's another piece of this story that almost never comes up. This generation entered the job market right around the dot-com bust of the early 2000s. Their first real jobs, their first apartments, their first genuine attempt at building an independent adult life. And the floor dropped out almost immediately. They rebuilt slowly and carefully, and just as many of them were finally reaching their most stable professional years, 2008 arrived and pulled the floor out from under them a second time. Economists have a specific term for this: a scarring effect. Financial instability experienced early in a person's tends to leave a lasting psychological mark that doesn't simply disappear once external circumstances improve. And it shows up in small, quiet, everyday decisions years later. An emergency fund that never quite feels large enough, no matter how much is in it. A backup plan quietly built, even when there's no obvious reason one would be needed. A faint hesitation before committing to something permanent, even when everything on paper looks completely fine. That hesitation isn't ordinary anxiety in the clinical sense. It's closer to muscle memory, the body remembering something that the conscious mind has already logically moved past. For anyone who has noticed this exact pattern in themselves without ever being able to trace where it came from, this is very likely the origin point. The invisible cost of being the bridge. There's something worth sitting with here, because not everything about this generational position is strength. Xennials often end up serving as the natural translator in almost every room they enter, mediating between older colleagues who value process, hierarchy, and established procedure, and younger colleagues who value speed, autonomy, and rapid iteration, between people who still feel anxious about adopting new technology and people who have never known a world without it. That bridging role looks like a genuine asset from the outside, and often it is one. But being the person who consistently bridges every gap in the room also means constantly absorbing friction from both sides, smoothing things over, translating intentions, making systems function, usually without anyone stopping to ask what that ongoing labor actually costs the person doing it. Psychologists refer to this as emotional labor, and people who carry it habitually, over years, tend to eventually stop noticing they're doing it at all. It stops registering as effort and starts feeling like simply how things are, which makes it remarkably easy to underestimate how much energy at sea actually consuming in the background. For anyone who has spent years being the reliable one in every room and felt a low-grade tiredness underneath that never fully resolved and never quite had a clear source, that tiredness isn't a personality trait. It's the accumulated cost of holding things together for other people, quietly, for a very long time. The person who rewound the tape return, for a moment, to that image of someone rewinding a VHS tape before returning it to Blockbuster, and then figuring out how MP3s worked just a few years later. That person didn't navigate that transition because they were especially adaptable by nature. They did it because they had no other real choice. The world changed underneath them, and they changed along with it, without drama and without losing the version of themselves that existed on the other side of that change. That's quieter than it sounds, and rarer than most people give it credit for. This generation watched one world end, not with any formal announcement, not with a clean, well-marked before and after line, but slowly, and then suddenly, the way large changes tend to happen when you're not watching directly for them. And then they watched an entirely new world begin, old enough to know exactly what was being left behind, young enough to move fully into what came next without getting permanently stuck at the border between the two. The scene between two worlds. Most people, across most of human history, only ever get one world, one relatively stable set of tools, norms, and expectations that they grow up inside and largely stay inside. Xenials got the seam instead, the exact place where one entire version of human life stitched into a completely different one within the span of a single adolescence. And they learned something important along the way, not as a deliberate lesson, but simply through the act of living it, that who you are doesn't have to be permanently determined by the world you happen to start out in. In a moment in history when the ground keeps shifting for almost everyone, regardless of generation, the people who have already practiced landing on their feet when the world moved beneath them, without ever losing track of exactly where they came from, carry something that genuinely can't be taught in any classroom. It can only be lived through.